Welcome to the Biltmore Church Podcast. Our church exists to glorify God by making disciples of Jesus who reach up, reach in, and reach out. And this podcast is a resource that's hopefully going to help you do just that. We're back for season 5. It has been awesome to have these conversations yet again. And this time we're jumping right into our 21 Days of Prayer teaching series where we're spending the next couple of weeks diving in together, committing together to take our biggest burdens to the Lord and asking Him to move in some incredible ways through prayer. And so today on our podcast episode, we had a great conversation about last Sunday and all that God did in our church. And we had an awesome conversation about what it means to be a child of God, what it means to pray as a child of God. What do you do while you're praying? So many cool application points out of today's episode. I'm very excited for you get to listen to this conversation. And so we're going to kick today's episode off by reading again our teaching text from last week, which was Matthew chapter 7, verse 7 through 11. Here we go.
Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds. And to the one who knocks, it will be opened. Or which one of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him?
All right, so quick introductions. My name is Christian Cooper. I serve on staff here, and I'm here today with our lead pastor, Bruce Frank. Back again, and Michelle Myers, who is our discipleship coordinator. Very excited to chat with you guys today and dive right back into our 21 Days of Prayer. That has been awesome for our church. So let's just start with some Sunday recap. Pastor, you preached Matthew 7 to 11, loaded passage, very practical sermon. So I'd love to just start with maybe what stood out from Sunday.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many questions. Prayer is mysterious. There are unanswered we want to address them. So I think just addressing the fact that, hey, there's a little mystery in here. Sometimes I pray and it happens. Sometimes I don't pray and it happens. Sometimes so you have all of that. And so but the biggest encouragement, the one that helps us to pray more is when we see prayer answered, and the second best would be when you hear about prayer answered. So, that's what's been super encouraging over the last week or 10 days, just to get these emails. And even during the response time, I've had people come up and go, hey, last 21 days of prayer, this is what we prayed for. And it's all over the map. I mean, a baby, marriage reconciliation, whatever that is, and seeing how God moves there. That spurs me on to pray more.
For sure.
But yeah, I mean, that's Matthew 7 the fact is, it says a good dad's not always going to answer it the way. And I had not really read it like that before. I just read it in the positive. But by definition, if a good dad is not going to, give you exactly what you ask, you've got to ask, the question again. It's like, all right, if you ask for a scorpion, do you give him a scorpion? Well, that's a dumb prayer request. So just that whole thing right there was encouraging. And just looking back on, I think that the touch point was the emphasis on the fatherhood of God. And is Packer the one that says that it's like that is your understanding of being a son or daughter of God shows your understanding of the Christian life and of the gospel. And I've thought about that for a long, long time, but I learned a lot of, how much Jesus did that and how revolutionary that would have been to the immediate audience that he was talking to. And the last thing was, and I don't know if, I bet you just knowing you two, y'all probably go toward that. But I would say as a task-oriented person, I mean, it is easy for me to default into, and again, God is judge, God is boss, God is those things, but primarily he's father. And so it was good for me to kind of just remind myself that ultimately, I think it was, I can't remember who had said it, maybe a Brit said it, he talked about ultimately more than a tool in the hand of God, you are a child in the family of God. And that is the correct perspective. Yeah, It's both, but first and foremost, you're a son before you're a servant. Yeah. And that mentality is huge. I mean, do you see yourself, if you look in Galatians, the difference between a son's mentality and a slave mentality, but you can, even as a believer, you can default, and I can default hugely into that category.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that was my main takeaway too, is just remembering to be a child and remembering that I am a child. And so with God, that's healthy for me to act that way, and for me to see him as that father, and for me to just the picture of when my kids come to me, understanding that that is how I am supposed to approach God. And sometimes I do think that we forget. And so we put this pressure on ourselves that is so unnecessary. And I think Paul Tripp was the one that said, hey, it was just in the context of parenting, but remember that in every moment that you are parenting, you are being parented. And I think that you could put that in the context of, hey, in every moment that you are leading, in every moment that you are showing up in a secular workplace, like whatever that is, like remember, you're being parented.
Yeah.
Your dad is there. He is with you. And so you can rely on him. You can go to him, and you're not by yourself. And so just that being parented, like as you go through life.
Yeah. I'd love to go back to something you mentioned just now, but also in your message, which is just those examples of how we tend to view God, right? Busy dad, clockmaker, policeman, boss, and he is many of those things, like you just said. But how have you seen those misconceptions impact people's prayer life, or their relationship with God?
Oh, well, I mean, in a huge, huge way. And even the way people perceived, if they had, again, I mentioned I had a good dad, and so, but it's a really easy way to say that. If you look at some of the more famous atheists, they all had terrible relationships with their dad. Not that that's the sole reason, but your earthly dad definitely impacts your ability. When you think father, if you had a good dad, that's not a big jump. If you had a bad dad, even like, people, the few stories I've heard, and some of the folks at the altar were like, I have to get over, my dad was an abuser, my dad was this, my dad was that, and it's taken me, and I knew God was different, but I still was harboring bitterness, or just stories like that that are coming out. But those things, I mean, it talks about what you think about, I think it's Tozer, what you think about when you think about God is the most important thing about you, which actually I would say the most important thing is what God thinks about you. But anyway, not going to compete with Tozer, but his point was, what comes to your mind, and so that is going to affect the way you pray. Because if you do see him as the clockmaker who just got it started, he's a distant God. He's really not concerned about whether you pass or fail or what's going on in your life. If you see him primarily as judge or policeman, again, he is both judge and lawgiver and all those things. But if that's your primary thing, if you see him as judge primarily, you're like, here's why you ought to hear my case, or here's why I ought to show some leniency. Or again, the policeman. Again, I love our law enforcement, but we pucker when they get behind us in the police car, even if we haven't done anything wrong. I mean, you're like, I don't want you there. I want you there when I need you, but I don't want you right behind me because I might have forgotten something. Or am I going 65 and a 55 allegedly? But again, that does impact, and because the way you see God is just, do you think about it this way? Do you really? I mean, I love our law enforcement, love judges, all those kind of things, but you're not like, I cannot wait to spend time around that judge. I cannot wait to spend. You're like, and so prayer, a lot of it is so relational. Do I want? I mean, like our kids. I want you want your kids that want to spend time with you, not have to spend time with you. And so that goes back to prayer, because prayer is spending time with the Lord, and it essentially it's relational. But if it's how you see God is going to determine whether you want to spend time with Him, which is prayer.
Yeah, that's really helpful. You also mentioned it's easy to forget that we're adopted into God's family. If we're in Christ, we've been adopted, and so we start acting like, hey, we're on our own. We've got to, be so independent and self-sustaining. We're acting like orphans, I think is maybe the phrase that you use. So, what would you say for people listening and watching? What are some of those orphan mindsets and actions that we need to be looking out for? Like, hey, if I'm here, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, I'm not acting like God's adopted child.
Well, I mean, I think the whole sanctification process is taking lies and replacing them with truth. And it goes back to identity. The behavior comes from, I act like how I think. I'm going to think it before I act it. And so if I'm thinking one way, and so that's what we talk about, first and foremost, your primary identity is an adopted son or daughter. And if it flows from that, then it's like, all right, even when I sin, it's like, all right, my first thought is I'm not acting like who I really am. And so it always goes back to that. But I mean, the whole thing has to be with, all right, the battleground for the Christian is right here. I mean, it's ultimately here in your heart, but really it's right here.
A lot.
I mean, it's like Comer's book, what Live No Lies. I mean, that whole disinformation campaign.
Yeah.
And so where's that? I mean, 2 Corinthians, Paul talks about, listen, those are strongholds, and how do you tear those strongholds down? You got to take down the thoughts that have gotten in there that make you think a certain way and then act a certain way. But the part that I was kind of resonating with me, we have a lot of folks that have adopted in our church, have adopted kids that are in our church, including one of my brothers over in Texas. And when you adopt, especially kids that have, the parallel between if you become a Christian at an early age, you still have those patterns you got to battle. But you've got a lot of truth that has also been there, so you've kind of got a lot of ammunition. But if you come to Christ late, you have a lot of patterns that have developed that it's going to take you a little bit longer to replace those. There's ruts or patterns or however you're thinking. In the same way, I think when you see people who've adopted it, I mean, there's some glorious stories, but there's also, it's hard.
Yeah.
Because if they came, as I mentioned, if they came from trauma or abuse or whatever, they have, even though they're legally adopted, they have an orphan mindset. And their orphan mindset is, in some cases, I've had to scrap for any bit of food that I got. I had to steal in order to survive. I couldn't trust grown-ups. My dad abandoned, or all those things. And so when your name gets changed and you're adopted, those patterns take a while to take away, both in the physical world, but in the spiritual world too.
Yeah.
I mean, I think all of us would think, I thought I'd be further along than I am right now.
Yeah.
If you'd asked me 10 years ago, would you still struggle with certain things? I was like, no, 10 years from now?
Yeah.
Walk
Of course
10
not.
more years with the Lord? That's going to be a distant memory. And yet some of the same insecurities or same patterns are still there. Now, they manifest a little differently. And there's some struggles that you kind of get complete victory over. You don't have to deal with them, or doubts or whatever that is. But some of those same root ones are like, golly, man, what in the world? Why am I still, is this ever going to, I mean, and the good news is, I guess, even guys like Paul, I mean, think about him. I would think that Paul's a Christian in Romans 7. I think that's a fairly safe agreement, even though amazingly some theologians, he wasn't a Christian. I was like, yeah, I think he was. He didn't go from Romans 6 being a Christian to Romans 7 not being a Christian, Romans 8 being a Christian.
Yeah.
But in Romans 7, I mean, he's still struggling.
Right.
There's some stuff I want to do, and I just don't do it. I mean, I've been there. There's some stuff I don't want to do, and I still do it. I've been there. And then at the very end of the chapter, before he goes into the great Romans 8, he's like, who will set me free from this body of death? And he's like, thank Jesus, he's set me free.
Right.
So, but he's still, it's a battle.
Having to come back to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think you said the words of just insecurity. When you said that, I was like, I think that's how it shows up in my life, which ultimately insecurity issues are identity issues. And so we have to go back and remind ourselves who we are. But those insecurities that probably lead to a little bit of people pleasing and just where you're seeking approval, like where your approval comes from. I think those are probably the signs of, if I am looking outside of God for approval, outside of God for my identity, if I'm trying to find security outside of God, those are all things that I think take us back into those orphan mindsets.
Yeah, I mean, you look at, if you look at, I used to think looking them up on the phone would be quicker than having. I am now
Sometimes
thinking I can turn pages quicker. But if you look like at the book of Galatians, which is it's to people that were believers that had gotten away from the gospel and gotten away from their identity. And in chapter 3 and 4, he deals all with adoption, and then he's like, man, who has bewitched you? You've gotten away from it. But to Michelle's point, I mean, even right at the very start, after it's a very quick introduction, but it's like, for am I now seeking the approval of man or of God?
Yeah.
Bible term for that is fear of man. Or am I still trying to please men? If I'm still trying to please men, I would not be a servant of Christ. And then he goes all just gospel, adoption, all of those things. And so he's telling these are not new problems. These are problems that people, 1900, 2000 years ago, their mindsets, they grew up with a certain mindset. In their case, they grew up in a slave mindset, but they were slave to the law, all those things. So again, nothing new. It's just our turn to learn it, and to me, it's the sanctification process. But it starts right up here, and that's why it's like, what did John 8:32? You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free.
That's right.
But you got to know the truth.
Yeah.
First.
Yeah. So I want to dive into some of that mystery of prayer that you mentioned a few minutes ago. First off, more personal question that I think will help lead to a second question, which is, have you ever gone through a season where your prayers felt either dry or that connection with God seemed distant? And then from that, what are some of the ways that as followers of Jesus, we find ourselves in that spot. How do we reignite our passion and dependence on God when it's tough?
I've never had a dry season. Ever.
Next question.
No, I've never had a dry season. Yeah, I mean, and our bent, I think probably you two are the same way. If I'm going to err, I'm not going to probably err in not reading the Bible. If I'm going to err, I'm going to just start doing perfunctory prayers, formal prayers, windshield prayers to God. If I'm going to err on one of those two, when everything's going strong and sweet, I mean, it's both and, full speed. But what that does is that ends up being, I mean, it's like, what you do, prayer or, airplane. It's like, or prayer or Bible study. It's like, those are the two wings of the airplane.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
And, both are needed. The prayer takes the Bible and puts it into your life. But on the other hand, if you're praying without the Bible, then you can pray some, you can get off on some tangents pretty good. I don't think there's a secret, because there have been, I still have seasons where I'm like, hopefully these don't happen that much, but they still happen where I'm like, what I need to do? I need to pray. I just need to stop what I'm doing and pray. And, you hear stuff like Martin Luther, where he's like, I'm so busy, I got to get up 3 hours early to pray.
Right.
And sometimes I'm like, man, that's what I should do. But instead, as a recovering control person, I'm just going to work harder.
I'll work my way out of
this.
Yeah.
And I think what prayer does, it goes back to that. Probably one of those little epiphanies this week was, because I was like, why is there so much teaching by Jesus on persisting?
Nonstop.
Because he tells us in the Sermon on the Mount, don't pray like the Gentiles, thinking all this repeating these phrases will just, you finally said it enough, I'll acquiesce and give it to you. So that's not it. He's not like the reluctant parent that is just, And so I still think I don't really know the reason. I think a part of that is, though, it does show dependence. And as I said yesterday, we hate dependence. I hate dependence because it's vulnerable but God loves that. Not because he's insecure. He just knows we need him anyway.
Yeah.
We are dependent.
Right.
We just don't know it sometimes. We don't know it. In ministry, I think we get refresher courses because, if you step on that platform or you step in front of a bunch of ladies or sing a song or whatever that is, you're like, I really need you. But it's really, you need him for every single thing anyway.
Yeah.
Whether we know it or not. So it's that, I think Crawford's book, it talks about, Crawford's book talks about it a lot. It's like, whether you know it or not, brokenness should lead to surrender, which is just a synonym for, synonym for dependence.
Yeah.
I think it was JD said, I tried to remember during the sermon yesterday because I didn't write it down. He's like, if dependence is the goal, that's what I can't remember. If dependence is the goal, which it should be, dependence, like apart from me, John 15:5, apart from me, you can do nothing.
Right.
Is that really true? I can do some stuff, but I can do nothing of spiritual significance.
Right.
Make a disciple. I can't do any of that stuff. Apart from me, I can do nothing. I can do activity, but apart from me, I can do nothing. If that is true, which let's go ahead and presupposition that what Jesus said is true, then if that is true, then I have got to be basically, and sometimes it's long seasons of prayer, long seasons, it might be on your knees for an extended period of time. And then sometime like Nehemiah, he's just like, I'm about to go see the king, help me with, I can't remember the exact phrase in like chapter 2. He's like, and I prayed before I went to the king. And the idea is he's like walking in there. And those are perfectly, sometimes people put those down, but that's, I think, part of when Paul says, pray without ceasing.
Yep.
It's like before you do a podcast, before, I pray as I walk up to the platform. So anyway, to answer your last question, I want to hear from Michelle as well. But I think you said something effective. What do you do when you do go through dry seasons? Some dry seasons are just your emotions. Because it's like James is going to say, draw near to God and God will draw near to you. And it's not that God left, it's you and I departed someplace. Sometimes you just don't sense it, doesn't make it true. It's like, I don't feel close to God. Well, that doesn't mean.
Right.
That doesn't mean anything. Emotions are good, but they're not to lead you. Sometimes there is something that's like, hey, there's just some area of repentance or trust that I need to be a part of. And sometimes it gets put down. There are times, we emphasize the gospel and grace and inside out, all that all the time. But there is a place for doing something when you don't feel like it.
Yeah.
Trusting God that the feelings will come back.
Right.
I mean, that's true with a marriage. That's true in any relationship. You're like, okay, the butterflies aren't there, but that doesn't change anything. So I'm going to do what I should do and then trust God with the feelings. And so sometimes it's like, you know what? I don't feel like really praying, but I'm going to pray until I feel like it.
That's great.
I don't really feel like reading the Bible, but I know from experience, if I do that, then the emotions will come back. So in a dry season, do what you know to do until the dryness leaves. That's the best thing I would say.
That's great.
Yeah. And I think sometimes too, if we are saying we don't know how to pray, then that means that we think that we have to have ourselves cleaned up or we have to have the perfect words to say before we get to God. And sometimes in a dry season, you just need to tell God, hey, I don't have words right now. I don't know what I need. I don't know what to ask for. I don't know what you're doing. I don't see this.
Yeah.
This is really hard. And so I need you to give me the words. I need you to give me the next thing, the next step, the next thing that I can do. Like, I don't have to know the way that it's going to end up. I just need something from you because I don't have it.
Well, think about the first miracle Jesus did in the wedding. I mean, she did not tell Jesus how to fix it.
Yeah.
All she did was just like, hey, there's no wine, which is a big deal back then. But it's a big deal now, but it's bigger deal back then.
Yeah. Right.
But if you think about it, all she did was like, here's the problem, and then told the other guys, hey, do whatever he says. And so to Michelle's point, sometimes, I mean, there's prayers, I mean, when it's really a significant burden, you probably already exhausted all the stuff you can do anyway. You don't even know how it's going to work. You don't even know what needs to happen.
Right.
So it's almost, but that's the dependence. Like, here's the deal. I don't know what to do. I don't even know what you need to do. All I know is it's yours, and you show me, and I'm going to do whatever you say.
Yeah.
What is my little role?
Yeah.
I mean, that's huge when it comes to like other people, especially when you talk about prodigals or marriages or that kind of stuff, and you can't change. You can't change somebody. You can't change them. As a matter of fact, a lot of times the more you try, it hurts.
Yeah.
So it's like, God, here's the deal.
Yeah.
I'm going to do whatever you say, but I don't even have the words to say anything. Michelle mentioned last week the Romans 8 passage about how it's fine. Just he'll take prayers even if they're kind of off base and turn them around so that they're correctly delivered. But yeah, I think that you mentioned last week, Christian, is like, what's the scariest part? The scariest part is when people won't talk to God because inside they don't even maybe identify it yet. Yeah. But somehow, and a lot of it is they prayed and didn't get answered, and then they locked down.
Yeah.
And that's why I want to say, hey, if you can say some stuff. Now, again, it shouldn't be, Jeremiah 20 is not your prayer pattern. You're not going to find that on the Daily Bread or in a bookstore. But it's not the only one. But it's like, until God says stop, you can keep praying and pray honestly. I mean, when kids come up, kids are not coming up super formal, watching exactly how their words are done, but they are dependent, and that was trying to do it. And the best resource, what's the guy's name that wrote The Praying Life?
Paul Miller.
Paul Miller. Yeah, that's a great book. And there's a lot of that book about praying like a child.
Yeah.
Right.
Praying to your Father. There's some good stuff. It'll be on the resource page. We put all the resources on the sermon deal. So click the resource page and you can see what stuff.
For sure.
Instead of stopping every 4 minutes and this quote came from.
Yeah.
Right.
Every once in a while, I'll try to.
You can't really put a footnote necessarily.
No, we don't manuscript it, so we can't do it. So we just put it on the website.
Yeah, that's awesome. So last question. I want to make sure for those who are praying really hard for some of these things, how do we make sure our prayers are paired with the right actions on our part? Sometimes we're praying about something and God's leading us to take part in that and to be part of that solution. So how do we make sure we're involved in that?
You're talking about when we're praying something and what do we need to do in the meantime? I want to hear your thoughts, but I would say one of the interesting, when it comes to salvation, when people say God helps those who helps themselves, that's actually not in the Bible. And it's actually anti-gospel when it comes to salvation. It's not completely anti-miracles and other stuff. Typically, when you look at the miracles in the Bible, he doesn't usually do the stuff we can already do. Not the miracles.
Yeah.
So there is, if he's like, let's say you're praying for, there's obviously a bunch of marriage stuff. So if you're praying for your marriage to be restored, and you're praying for that, and then you should. And there's some stuff you cannot do. You cannot change your partner's heart, all that kind of stuff. But there might be some stuff you could do. For example, God might say, you know what, you need to apologize because of X, Y, and Z. You need to, it could be as simple as you need to pray for, your spouse. You need to, I was talking to a guy this morning at breakfast, and he said, and this, you forget what you say, but I guess a long time ago I said, one of the things you ought to do is ask your spouse, how can I help you today?
Yeah.
How can I help you? And I'd forgotten saying that, but he's like, I always, he was giving advice to somebody else. And he said that this guy that he gave advice to went home to his wife, and he's like, and before they left, he's like, how can I help you today? And this guy said his wife looked at him like he had three heads. Who is this man I'm now married to? I've never heard that question come out. So, there are, as you're praying, what is your role? What you can't do is control. I mean, you can't control, but that control's a figment of our imagination anyway. I'm not to get off on an esoteric take here, but if you try to control everything, you don't do what you can do. If you try to control whether your money, your health, if you try to control you can't control it. Yeah. And sometimes God allows some stuff to peek through to show you and I, hey, you don't understand how small you really are. I mean, I love you, but come on now, you can't control it anyway. We just think we can. So do what you can do. I think Lori had said one time about is it Romans 12? She said the problem with living sacrifices is they always crawl off the altar. So the challenge for us is, whatever that is that you're praying about, that most significant burden. It's okay to ask, have I done everything I can do? And then for 21 days, am I putting that on the altar or I'm putting myself on the altar? I know God's got to be the one that does this. That's why I said most significant burden, because significant means you tried stuff. It's not like, even something like I got a football game. Well, you can pray you win a football game, but if you hadn't worked out, you're going to get your tail handed to you.
Yeah.
So there is stuff you do, but anyway,
that's great.
You do what you can do, and then when it comes to that, but you pray. It all depends on it all depends on the Lord anyway. But it doesn't mean that He's not going to. What's that old thing saying? It's like, somebody did a garden or something, and he prayed, and he said, man, look what God did. He said, but God wasn't doing much until I got my hands dirty and actually planted some seeds. So in other words, there might be some things that He wants you to do, and then God does what only He can do.
What is the Paul line about? Apollos did this, I did this, and God brought the fruit kind of thing.
I planted, Apollos watered, and God gave the growth.
Yeah. I mean, again, even down to evangelism. I mean, God's the one that saves, but He usually uses the mouths of one of His kids.
Right. I mean, I think there's always, you can obey some way. And so how can you obey God in some way? And then also too, just asking Him like, hey, show me your faithfulness. Remind me of the ways that you have been faithful in the past. I think that when we do have those things where we're not sure how it's going to end up, we can look at how the pattern of God's faithfulness in your life.
That's good.
Go back and look at all the ways that He has been faithful, knowing that His character does not change. And so He will always be faithful. And so ask, hey, I want to see the little ways that you are being faithful, even before like this is done. Show me your faithfulness today, and then anchor your hope in those things of what you talked about of anchor your hope in His character, not just in His answer. And so make those things be the things that you cling to. And there's a lot of joy there when you actually just watch all the ways that God is working around you and not just focus on that one thing.
Yeah.
I mean, her point about the character of God, that is, and it should be easier the longer we're a believer. It's not always that way, but if you've seen God work in the past, it can be easier to trust Him for the future. If you look at Job, I mean, he's like Job. Even when he's going through all of that stuff, he relied to some degree on knowing God's character from his past walk. Right. And so it should be. It's like if you've seen God work 100 times in your life. I mean, honestly, the three of us, we should have the most faith on paper. Because there's not a week that goes by where we don't hear stories of God at work. Now, a lot of our, folks in church, they don't hear that every week. We hear it every week, multiple times a week. And then when we have staff meeting week, you hear it, 50 times. And so that should, like, look at that, look at that. So if God, and so in some ways, even like the little video testimonies and stuff we do, it's to glorify God. It's also to build their faith. Because the sub question is, listen, if God can do that, even if it maybe frustrates him, why won't God do it in my, that's what happened there, but I want him to happen. I mean, I've had that feeling too.
Yeah.
But in some ways, you're also like, all right, I remember that story from this and this and this. Well, maybe God will do it in mine.
Okay, so we are sharing prayer practices of how do we take all that we've talked about, put it into practice. And so last week we talked about turning our worries into prayers.
Yes.
And I know that this week you have a practice for us that you use a lot.
Yes. Okay. I'm very excited about this. So one very helpful practice to grow in prayer from my own life has been making prayer cards. I got this idea actually from Paul Miller, who we talked about on today's episode a little bit. He has an awesome book on prayer. But I literally have a stack of 3x5 index cards. And I literally, on Amazon, I bought a little white box.
Love that.
Like people used to put business cards in. So I've got a box. I've got 3x5 index cards. So pretty much anything that I'm praying for or anything that I'm praying about has a card to go with it. There's a ton of benefits to that. So I've got cards for people that I'm praying for. I've got cards for circumstances that I'm walking through. I've got some cards that are just scripture that I'm praying, really anything. So if you ask me to pray for you, and I know what it is you're asking me to pray for you about, I'm going to make a card. And then I'm not going to forget about it. It's going to be there for me. And then I have that ready, so when I go to pray, I can pray over you. So many different uses for that. But here's what's great, for me at least, is every day when I sit down to pray, instead of trying to remember all the things that I could be praying for, to make a fresh list every day and make sure I don't miss anything important, or losing focus when I'm praying and my mind starts wandering, I've got like dozens and dozens of cards that I can just sift through and pray through, whether it's on the floor or on my desk. They're just there. And then I have those things that I can pray over. So super simple to start.
That's awesome.
You just need cards and a pen.
So walk us through maybe what's written on a couple of the cards. Like when you write it, do you add to it? Like the longer you pray? What's your process?
Yeah, sort of. So I'll give you a couple examples. Like for me right now, I've got a card for my wife. So I have a card. I just write. It's just got Ashley written on the top. Couple keywords that I'm praying over for her right now, and then I'll just attach some scriptures. So if I'm reading the Bible and I see a scripture, I'll just pull that, and either I'm making a card for somebody else or for myself or for her. So like right now, I just pulled them out. So you kind of run through them. So right now I'm praying Ephesians 3, 16 to 19. I'm praying Philippians 1, 9 to 11, and I'm praying Colossians 1, 9 to 12 over her. So example of that is like, all those verses are basically like Paul's prayers for the church. I'm just turning those into prayers for her. Like I've got a card for my one, right? So I've got that person's name listed at the top, and then you can just write in a couple of verses about God's heart for the lost. So like I've got Mark 6, Jesus had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So I'm praying like, Lord, you already have compassion on this person. They're a sheep without a shepherd. Would you save them? Would you draw them in? That kind of thing. I got a card like, I just finished reading Romans, so I came across a verse that stood out, and I was like, I need to be praying this over myself. So Romans 15:13, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in hope.
So good.
So now I've got that card. Every day I can go through, I'm praying this over me today. So I've just found a great way to take what I'm reading, what I'm learning, what I know I want to pray for or should pray for, and now I've got like a paper trail that I can go in and do it.
It's so good.
So anyway, it's a great place to start.
Yeah.
You can literally make like one card, and then over time, like you just keep adding a little bit. All of a sudden you've got a box full of cards of things that you're praying for. So hopefully that's helpful.
That's so helpful and so good if you're one that like your mind tends to wander of how to stay focused. So
just
good.
Flipping cards.
Yep.
You can put them on like one of those little, this is kind of old school, but you know, in school you had the little like, the ring, like the keychain ring, you punch the hole in the card and you're flipping through like your flashcards, like you're learning math.
I actually have like a mini flip chart on my desk. And that's what I do.
It's a great way to do it. Great way to do it. So hopefully everybody listening, watching today, I hope that helps you. We just want to give you some very simple, practical steps you can take to grow in your prayer life. Again, like that prayer card's not in the Bible,
Right.
but a great way to practice what is in the Bible.
Yes.
So hopefully that helps you. I hope today's conversation in general has been helpful for you. That's the goal. We want you to be able to follow Jesus as closely as you can in the days ahead as we go on this 21 days of prayer journey. Hope to see you on Sunday at one of our campuses. We're going to be back next Wednesday.
That's right.
As we continue this series. As always, you are loved and sent.